Ah, what a pleasant way to spend a summer day here in beautiful Humboldt County. Strolling along this quiet country road on Table Bluff, south of Humboldt Bay. But you know, over 150 years ago, this road was anything but quiet. In fact, for several decades ending in the late 1880s, this is said to have been the busiest wagon road in all of Humboldt County. These buildings that you see behind me are what remains of the once lively, bustling old west town of Table Bluff. And the reason it was so lively is because 5 major wagon roads converged right here. Now, one thing you have to understand, in the 1800s, the main way goods and services were transported over land were by horse-drawn wagons. And any of those supply wagons that traveled between Humboldt Bay to the north or the Eel River Valley to the south would go right through this town of Table Bluff. And we're talking a lot of wagons. On most days, between 100 and 200 horse-drawn freight wagons would rumble right through here, often kicking up clouds of dust on warm, dry summer days like today. So when the wagon trains arrived here, they had just come off of a long, grueling ride uphill to this higher point on the bluff. Oh, and they were thirsty, hot, and tired. And this building that you see behind me, it's now a private residence, but it used to be a lively tavern and saloon where these tired drivers could stop in for a drink or a bite to eat while their horses rested. Later on, it became a hotel where they could even spend the night. And right next door to this old tavern saloon is another historic building. And right next door to the old saloon, tavern, hotel, we have the blacksmith shop. Now, the wagons that arrive here just come up a long, rough, rutted dirt road, and often they needed repairs. Well, this is where they could get them fixed. And also in this town of Table Bluff, nearby, there was a post office, 2 schools, 2 churches, 2 stores, and even 2 cemeteries. And next, I'll be heading over to one of those cemeteries, the Table Bluff Cemetery, which is only about a mile southeast of here on this road. And there I'll be meeting local authors, Barry Evans and Jerry Rohde, and they are going to take me to grave sites of some colorful and interesting folks who lived here in Table Bluff while it was in its heyday. One of those grave sites will be of the notorious Seth Kidman, who is the proprietor of this saloon. And they're also going to take me to the gravesite of the Perrault sisters, one of whom perished in tragic circumstances, and the older sister Laura, who helped to found the Humboldt County Women's Save the Redwood League in 1919. So, I reckon I should invite you to join me as I amble down the road here to the Table Bluff Cemetery to meet up with Barry Evans and Jerry Rohde to learn a little bit more about this old west town of Table Bluff and about some of the interesting and colorful characters who lived right here in Humboldt outdoors. There we are, Table Bluff Cemetery, dead ahead. You know, there's one thing I want to clear up that can be a little bit confusing. Where we were is known as the old town of Table Bluff, which sits atop a geologic formation known as Table Bluff, which is a high ridge with a somewhat flat top. And that is a ridge that begins right at the edge of the ocean, just south of Humboldt Bay, extends about 8 to 10 miles southeast all the way to some low hills near the Eel River Valley. Now, in the 1800s, Table Bluff, the geologic formation, was a major impediment to travel between the Eel River Valley to the south and Humboldt Bay to the north. Wagon trains, they couldn't real easily go around the bluff, so they had to go over it. They had to go up these steep roads, cross over the bluff, and then drop down to the other side. And all the wagon roads crossing over Table Bluff converged on the town of Table Bluff. Okay, so now a big game changer occurred in the early 1880s when a railroad tunnel was blasted right through Table Bluff. So now, to transport goods, instead of having to go over the bluff, now they could go through the railroad tunnel. So about a year ago, Barry took me on a tour of the Lolita Tunnel. And while we were in the middle of the tunnel in the dark, Barry told me something astounding.
And Ray, above us, right above us, about 250 feet, is Table Bluff Cemetery.
And the Table Bluff Cemetery is where we are going right now. Hey Barry, yet another adventure.
Good to see you, buddy.
Yeah, ever since you took me in that Lolita Tunnel adventure, I've been dying to go on another adventure with you, and here we are.
Here we are, 250 feet above the Lolita Tunnel.
You brought Jerry
We
along.
brought Jerry along. Jerry's book, Both Sides of the Bluff, really covers what we're going to be talking about.
So this bluff was a significant impediment to travel north and south, east and west for the movement of goods and commerce. During like what time era?
Well, from the first start of white occupation up here in 1850 until 1884, when they put a tunnel under the bluff, you had to go over the bluff for almost any type of travel. And you got to remember that this bluff was like a wall between the two most active, most viable parts of Humboldt County. Up to the north, you had Humboldt Bay ports at Fields Landing and up at Eureka, and over on the south side of the bluff, you had the Eel River Valley, which was this fertile agricultural area where in the early days, potatoes were grown. Eventually they did dairying there. They had apple orchards, fruit orchards, and so the breadbasket for Humboldt County, or the main part of the county, was over here on the south side. The hungry mouths that needed to eat all this stuff was on the north side around Humboldt Bay. And so you had to have some kind of connection between those two areas.
And everything converged at what became the town of Table Bluff.
Yeah, so Table Bluff, with all of this activity, was probably the most active, lively place in Humboldt County. And they had between 100 and 200 wagons and stages coming across every day. It was really, really steep for these teams to try to make it up the top. And they could spend like half a day, and by the time they got to the top of the bluff, the horses were tired, the drivers were tired, they needed to stop and rest. Fortunately for us, and for preserving the history, you can go there and see two of the physical pillars of that community. You can see the old Table Bluff Hotel that Seth Kinman owned, and right next to it you can see the blacksmith that his son Cal operated. And those were probably the two most important buildings in town, because the horses, needed repair for their shoes and things like that at the blacksmith shop. And meanwhile, at the hotel, there was also Kinman's Saloon. So even if you're going to stay overnight, you could stop and have a drink. And you can imagine what it's like spending 6 hours coming up from the Eel River behind a dozen other wagons in the dust and the heat. Yeah, I'd want more than one drink.
So Jerry, this wasn't always Table Bluff. This was Ralawaka.
Yeah, there was a system of trails that went all the way through Wiyot territory, and when the first white explorers came through, the Wiyots helped guide them along those trails. A lot of the Indians here were killed or sent to reservations, and the whites just came in and took over everything. The Wiyots were left without any land at all. They had to come back and actually buy property if they wanted to have a place to live. So we're on what was traditionally Wiyot ground. Well, this is a especially interesting situation up on Table Bluff, because you had two cemeteries in a very small community. Mm-hmm. They were about a mile apart, and over to the west of where we are now was the Catholic cemetery, very close to downtown or uptown Table Bluff. And over here we had basically the Protestant cemetery for anyone who wasn't Catholic who came to this cemetery.
So Ray, why don't you come on into the cemetery. Jerry's going to take you to a couple of grave sites that he's interested in, and I'm going to check on something over here, and we'll see you in a minute.
Oh, great place to start, the Seth Kinman gravesite. Well, this one has a chain around it, so I'll just stand outside of the chain here.
Seth Kinman is certainly the most notorious figure in early Humboldt County history. We know that he was here in the early 1850s. He was up on Table Bluff. He built a saloon there, but he did a lot of work to make money for himself. He went out and he shot animals to feed the soldiers at Fort Humboldt. He would shoot elk, he would shoot deer, and without any compunction at all, he would shoot Indians.
Oh no.
Yeah, Seth saw them as an obstacle. He wanted them out of the way.
So can you tell me a little bit about Seth Kinman's saloon in Table Bluff?
Saloon was probably the most important part of the Table Bluff community. All the wagoners were coming up. They were thirsty after a long trip up the hill. And you could go in and you could get a couple of drinks and the horses could cool off and you could hang out there for a little while. But it was a rough and tumble place. He had these weird chairs in there. He made chairs out of elk horn, whalebone, and one even out of a grizzly bear, and he would present these chairs to different presidents of the United States. He'd actually take a chair back with him and give it to the president. Like the grizzly bear went to Andrew Johnson, the successor to Abe Lincoln.
I could just imagine Seth sitting in his saloon regaling his customers with his wild stories of meeting the US presidents.
But he also would play his fiddle, and he actually handmade a violin out of elk bone, and somehow he could play that. It must have sounded terrible.
And about what phase of life was Seth in when he was operating his saloon in the town of Table Bluff?
Seth spent the rest of his life after he got to Humboldt County up in the Table Bluff area. And in 1888 he died and was buried here in the cemetery.
It really strikes me, you come into the cemetery, these are people who lived a full life during the heyday of Table Bluff. Good deeds, bad deeds, heroic deeds, terrible deeds, and yet they're all buried here together in this cemetery.
Yeah, if they were alive at the same time and standing this close to one another as where they're buried, they would be very uncomfortable.
Well, thank you, Jerry, for taking the time to tell me the stories about Seth Kinman. I'm gonna go meet Barry over at his grave and hoping you'll join us in a little bit to offer some closing thoughts about the Table Bluff Cemetery. Okay, see you there. Before meeting up with Barry at the next grave, I wanted to tell you a little bit about this tombstone. I asked Jerry about it, and he told me this tombstone is an old redwood plank, and they used to carve the name of the deceased with their date of birth and their date of death. Jerry told me that when he first started coming here about 30 years ago, about half of these graves had these old redwood tombstones. They've all sort of fallen away over time, and this, as far as I can see, is the only one left. And Jerry said this one could easily be over 100 years old. Okay, let's go meet up with Barry at the next gravesite.
Hey Ray, good to see you again.
Hey Barry, the Rohde family I see.
So this stone, it's actually got a lot of other names on it, of members of the Rohde family buried here beneath our feet. But this is the only one with an epitaph. And what an epitaph. Let me read you the whole thing, can I?
Yes.
In memory of Luella Perrott, born June the 19th, 1871, died June 24th, 1891. So she was 5 days beyond her 20th birthday.
Oh, she was so young.
And listen to this. A soul by nature pitched too high, by fortune pitched too low. She was found with a pistol shot to her heart in a shed behind the farmhouse just a mile from here. And at first it was ruled a suicide, but she'd been having an affair with a native Indian guy, and he was charged with murder. He was held in Eureka for 3 months. They had 7 trials. On the final trial, he was acquitted. But that took all three months going through endless, one trial after another, because they were having hung juries every time. My heart goes out to Luella, 20 years old.
Oh, and Barry, Here's the gravesite of Luella's older sister, Laura. I read all about Laura in your book, The Humboldt too, and what an inspirational story that is. Let's talk about Laura, if you wouldn't mind.
This is the gravestone for Laura Perrott Mahan. She was 4 years older than Luella, and she was the founder and president of the Humboldt County Women Save the Redwood League. Really, she led the whole effort to save what we now know as Founder's Grove. Which is
beautiful stretch.
And without her, I'm not sure that we could have been walking through Founder's Grove now. If you go to Founder's Grove today, you walk through the trails, you will eventually stumble upon the Mahan plaque, which is dedicated to Laura and to James Mahan. She was the one who really spearheaded that whole effort to save that stretch of the redwoods. So that's the story of the Perrott family. And hey, Jerry, before you go, I think we should talk a little bit about the demise of the town itself, which was obviously starting with the tunnel. It's 250 feet below our feet. That was completed in 1884.
Yeah, because that meant that the railroad could take over hauling all the cargo that had to go over the top of Table Bluff. And so pretty quickly the town started diminishing in importance. And in 1898, so we're talking about 14 years later, the Humboldt Times had a little bit to say about how the town had already started to kind of shrivel up. And I'd like to read just a little bit about what they said. So they said, "The completion of the Valley Railroad told heavily to the detriment of the little highland town which looked down on the bay to the north and Eel River Valley and the Coast Range of mountains to the south. The old stage barn in which the relay stock was cared for looks deserted and somber in its loneliness. Where 2 stores once flourished, there are none." And by 1914, they had a strip of concrete coming up and going over the top of the hill so autos could travel on it.
Redwood Highway.
Redwood Highway. And a couple of years later, in 1917, once again, the Humboldt Times writes a kind of elegy for Table Bluff. And they said this time, "The scouts, the trail makers, the miners, all have crossed the Great Divide. Never again will the tinkle of chime bells and grind of brake irons herald the coming of the freight caravan."
250 feet is Table Bluff Cemetery.
Great, you guys nailed it.
You really hammed that up, didn't you? Redwood warehouses down there, big buildings where
Okay,
they
you're
could
going
store
off
stuff.
topic. We're sticking
Okay.
with the Table Bluff.
Okay.
We want to know what on Table Bluff.
Bluff,
I
okay,
want
what-
to know.
This is what happens when
I
you
know.
have a historian along.
Let's go. Let's get back to Table Bluff.
This was in the old days, and I'm talking
you know
about
what?
the 18.
I'm sorry, you should be telling me this. You say, Ray, let me elaborate on what Jerry said. You guys are telling me this. You're not telling Jerry.
I already know it.
Yeah.
The miners all have crossed the Great Divide.
The Great Divide.
The Great Divide.
I thought that was the Rockies, but hey.
Well, we're on a divide right here on top of Table Bluff.
Okay.
More fun watching Ray in action. I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille.